Right. Now let's look at the second poem. Daffodils No More. A clear reference to Wordsworth's poem, Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a crowd. In Wordsworth's poem, it was I wandered lonely. Here, I wondered. He's wondering, he's thinking. I wandered like a crowd, lonely as a crowd that flows down streets and avenues, my spirit darkened by a cloud of troubles I could not refuse. For I had looked for daffodils and found but few in England's hills. Now, this is definitely ironical. He's like one among the many urbanites living in a city, wandering along city streets. My spirit darkened. All these are clear references to lines in Wordsworth's poem. And I had troubles which I could not refuse, he says. He could not refuse the troubles coming to him. He was looking for daffodils, but he couldn't find many. He could find just a few. In Wordsworth's time, the hills were replete with daffodils. Daffodils grew everywhere, like what Changampuഴ said. എവിടെ തിരിഞ്ഞൊന്ന് നോക്കിയാൽ എന്ത് അവിടെല്ലാം പൂത്ത മരങ്ങൾ മാത്രം. Of course, Changampuഴ was exaggerating. In his days, we had very few forests where woodlands where flowers grew in such thick abundance. So in any case, you had such wilderness in Wordsworth's time. But here he was looking for daffodils. Why should he look for daffodils? We wonder. That's what I said. This poem might be ironical. Okay. As if a quest for daffodils is something very remarkable. So, next stanza. For butterflies, for birds I sought, for all of nature's finest gems that I had long been taught, bedecked the Pennines and the Thames. Okay. The valley, Pennines Valley and the Thames, the banks of the Thames. So the operative phrase is, I had long ago been taught. So in his childhood he was taught that England still had these flowers, the finest gems of nature in abundance. This is clearly ironical. So he had been taught to believe. The literature is, of course, always old-fashioned. So when you read Daffodils, you don't know that even in Wordsworth's time, Britain had been very heavily industrialized. Immediately after the advent of the Industrial Revolution, England was not something that nature could be proud of. Yeah. So it said that Wordsworth had invested in the newly came up industries, so that he had a private income which would allow him to live in peace in the Lake District and write his poems. See the irony there. So here I think definitely the poet is speaking with his tongue in his cheek. So he had been taught that these daffodils could be found in plenty in the Pennines and the Thames. That they caressed our valleys, blessed our moorland, empty, rocky land. They are called moors, found in some parts of England and Scotland. Okay, where bushy plants, flowering plants grew. So he thought that all over England, in the valleys, on moorland, he could find these flowers. But he didn't find any. What I found was barbed wire fence protecting repetitious fields that offered up in self-defense statistics on their better yields, with never a thought towards the cost, that fragile beauty we have lost. This is very clearly ironical. You won't mistake it. So when he looked for flowers in the countryside, what he found was cultivated fields, crops, protected by barbed wire fence, probably from wild animals. Look at the phrase he uses. Repetitious fields. Yes, there is repetition everywhere. These Fields, you find the same kind of fields for kilometers, probably hundreds of kilometers. Farmland, okay. Crops growing in abundance without a break. No weeds, no thistles, as we found in Ted Hughes's poem. So the distinction between weeds and crops is clearly made. Okay, so what is the justification for erecting these barbed wire fences? Well, the justification is something like our green revolution. You have statistics of what yields these fields have. Thousands, millions of tons of food grains. So that is the justification. If you don't have fields with crops, you can't feed the population of the country. So this is clearly ironical. What do you want? Do you want daffodils or food? The poet seems to imply. Okay, he can't say this directly. But the poet seems to imply that the question is whether you need food or daffodils. Everybody would raise their hands for food. They will say in a chorus. So probably it's better to have food than daffodils. And England's population probably doubled or tripled, has doubled or tripled since Wordsworth's time. So you can't think of the same yield that fields gave way back at the end of the 18th century. So that's the thing. So that is the only justification these farmers have to offer. Why have they destroyed daffodils? Why have they erected barbed wire fences? Because they have to produce crops in the fields. They have to feed the population. England, I believe, is not self-sufficient in food grains. It still imports food grains. Right. So this is the $1 million or £1 million question. What do you need? Daffodils or crops? Food grains. Yeah. A poet could not help but sigh on seeing how the world is changed. So the poet sighs. Okay. Somebody like our poet who talked about Kannandali Pookal. When the K-Rail project was announced, some poets were deeply upset about the environmental degradation it would cause. So like them, of course, the question of whether the K-Rail project ought to be implemented hinges on several other parameters, not just the destruction of the environment. So, but the poet has to sigh. The poet by nature is a sighing creature, he seems to say, very interestingly. A poet could not help but sigh on seeing how the world is changed and ask himself or God on high. He has to ask either himself or to God. All these are irony-tinged words, unmistakably. Why humankind is so deranged? We ask ourselves or we ask God. Why is humankind so deranged that it can destroy, for such poor ends, objectives, the world on which its life depends? Yeah. So the poet seems to say the human mind destroys objects, destroys nature, destroys plants, flowers, on which his or the humankind's life depends. So this is a two-edged statement. Okay, you can read it as an ironical statement, or you can read it as a straightforward expression of environmental concerns. Yeah. So have a better look at the poem. You'll find that there are many what we would call in Malayalam Andardhara, okay, undercurrents that mark this poem. It's not a straightforward, deep ecological poem anyway.